What if I told you we could make it like none of this ever happened? What would you be willing to sacrifice for that?
I loved all these things about her equally.
Some believe there are alternate realities with other lives that we're leading.
How many copies of ourselves exist? And might our mental states be conjoined?
Chikai Bardo. I don't know, it looks like two guys fighting.
No, it's the same guy fighting himself, defeating his own psyche. Ego death.
Great science fiction uses the technology of its world not to tell mundane cautionary tales of evil robots or time-travelling bunnies, and it doesn't always have to be about the fate of the universe. Instead, it builds a world where that technology can show us the heart of the human experience in unexpected ways. This is grief, love, and trauma, where Mr. Robot walked, so Severance can run.
No matter what happens tomorrow, or for the rest of my life, I'm happy now. Because I love you.
I think I'm happy too.
Some of the most poignant texts in recent television and cinema history employ elements of science fiction or fantasy to tell us stories not about these genres, but about ourselves. A classic example, Groundhog Day, employs a plot device of a daily loop for its protagonist Phil Connors, but the audience never learns what causes this anomaly, or even how it is happening. We learn of the parameters of its operation only. We know that Phil relives Groundhog Day and he will always awake in his bed the very same morning, and that he cannot die. From there, the whole heart of this film is Phil's almost karmic journey to betterment. The science fiction and fantasy fully gives way for a story about a man who learns to love himself and dedicate himself to the service of others. Many texts today, I feel, have become too bogged down in the operation of their plot devices. They no longer treat the inciting forces in their worlds as opportunities for meditation on core human experience. They instead become bloviating exposition puzzle boxes, which will always leave the viewer dissatisfied. Mr. Robot, which began airing on the USA Network in 2015, represents, in my view, a step change in storytelling. But to understand how it was so successful, we should examine two texts, which in my view, failed.
Two players, two sides. One is light, one is dark.
Lost pioneered a style of answering questions while posing two more, and it was this one step forward, two step backwards approach that would eventually leave its showrunners with a lot of untidy loose ends and an audience that demanded answers. And while early seasons, I feel, got the balance just about right, by the time of its conclusion, Lost had become a puzzle box. It was labyrinthian, but in the early run we had storylines where there was a palpable tension in the unknown. What is the hatch? Why is it here? Who is inside? Why is there a computer? Who built this place? What was the incident? The spin-offs from one simple metal door in the jungle were dizzying and delightful.
Type in exactly what I tell you. Understand exactly, nothing else. 4. 8. 15. 16. 23. 42. Now press execute.
What's gonna happen?
Just push it!
Unfortunately for Lost, because it spent so much time posing more and more questions, adding more and more detail, towards the end of its final seasons, it was actually the subject of a decent amount of public ridicule for the severe lack of answers included in its narrative. I actually remember a relatively fun parody that was done by GMM stars Rhett and Link, a little song posing all of these questions that had to be answered before the end of Lost.
When Jim survived, how could he time travel when he was so far away from the island? So the only way that would be possible is if Jim jumped off the ship and landed unconscious in the water, then somehow managed to move downstream following the precise bearing of either 325 or 305, depending if you go by the number Michael was given by Ben or Lapidus was given by Faraday, and end up close enough to the island to time jump with everyone else all in a matter of seconds, which seems completely preposterous, but they probably hope nobody realizes that it makes no sense.
And we'll likely never get an answer.
There's far too many questions to fit into just one song. Listing every single thing will make this song far too long. So here's a few more to ponder on, so you can continue to read.
I think Lost and Westworld are a cautionary tale for the writing team at Severance. These are two programs that had a lot of promise in their opening 2 seasons. They both introduced us to ethical and real-life conundrums that were relatable to audiences. But I think where both of these programs ended up losing their way is that instead of continuing to focus on these characters who we cared a lot about, both programs expanded out the scale and scope of their worlds. And in Lost's case, that expansion came in the form of multiple timelines and new themes, new places, new worlds, new people. And it introduced a great deal more misdirection and Easter egg and hidden meaning, as well as just straight up dead ends to the story. Westworld became a little bit more of a maze, which is ironic considering that one of the central visual motifs of its first season was a maze, a game for the robots to play to find the consciousness within themselves. I think both of these shows, unfortunately, from my perspective anyway, became too bogged down in creating the detail of their worlds, and they forgot to continue to develop the characters who we cared about so much. In Westworld's case too, characters who we were made to care about and were given a great deal of detail on their backstory and motivation, many of them were either dropped or no longer considered a crucial part of the story throughout the final seasons, and indeed the story went off in a direction that I don't think the program ever particularly signposted was in its remit, and that's borne out by the fact that declining ratings and slipping reviews eventually led to the program being cancelled. But Lost wasn't cancelled, and it still had a highly dissatisfying ending that many would say is one of the most controversial endings in television history. How can Severance avoid a similar fate? I think you only need to look at the way that Mr. Robot was written and the clues we can see in the way Severance is currently being written to feel relatively confident that a similar fate just isn't in the cards for Severance. At its core, Mr. Robot is a story about trauma. The trauma of all of its leads is, in essence, the inciting force of this universe. The character White Rose is a transgender woman living in a conservative and oppressive society who suffered a great loss early in her life and has subsequently dedicated the entirety of her existence and the majority of the runtime of this program to righting that wrong. Now, by the end of the show, we're asked to consider whether or not she is capable of constructing a multi-dimensional time travel machine underneath a nuclear power station in Washington Township, and we never truly get to understand if she was able to do that or not, but it doesn't matter. She did these things because of the trauma in her life. The actions she took that were an inciting force in the entire Mr. Robot cinematic universe. These are elements of her personality that justify everything she does inside the world. And in fact, it was those actions that she took that would be the inciting force in Elliot's character's life and would effectively precipitate the events of the program. Esmail wrote a heart into the character of Elliot and a heart into the story of Mr. Robot. And it's that centering of the story around trauma, around grief, and around love that makes it such a compelling story to watch. Mr. Robot tells us that it's better to tell a story centered around a human experience, and then you can dress the window. But so long as you make those characters believable, and you give them a core that any audience can understand, then everyone can walk away from it feeling satisfied. I truly think the end of Mr. Robot is one of the most satisfying conclusions in recent television history. It is at once an explaining exercise, and in another breath leaves you with a few open questions. But the questions it leaves open are questions not about why was this thing hinted at in season 2 and never then further explained or considered, and why did you go to a great deal to show us this character who was never introduced again? Nothing like that lingers on the palate after finishing Mr. Robot. Instead, the questions are more fundamental to the human experience. It's a really excellent piece of writing, and I think if we hadn't have had Mr. Robot commissioned by USA Network almost 10 years ago, then we wouldn't be enjoying Severance today. Severance had the opportunity to do exactly what Lost and exactly what Westworld did, and there was, of course, a great deal of reporting around the time of the development of Season 2 that there was disagreement and creative difference in the writers' room, and I can't begin to speculate on how that particular issue manifested itself. But I like to think that whatever that was, it led to us having a more grounded human story in Season 2 of Severance. It could have decided to break down the walls of the Lumen office and take the issue to the streets, or expand the stakes to an international conspiracy. People on Reddit seem to believe that MDR was poisoning water supplies around the world, or engaging in targeted corporate espionage, or perhaps it was a complicated global government coup d'etat. Many theories on grandiose scale, and who knows, maybe something like that is happening at Lumen. But in the most recent episode of Severance, I think we saw compelling evidence that this entire building, and perhaps this entire procedure, is centered around the relationship between a grieving husband and his, until recently believed to be, dead wife. We understand now that there is an entire floor of this building dedicated to one woman, and that all she really wants is to be reunited with her husband. Severance is a love story, and so is Groundhog Day, and so is Mr. Robot. These were stories that I think were centered around simple human emotions. And yes, they're science fiction stories, and yes, they are detailed and richly drawn, confusing and mysterious worlds. Severance is confusing and mysterious to us as an audience because I believe its characters are experiencing confusion and mystery on a daily basis. Severance isn't supposed to be solved. It's not a maths equation or a puzzle or a maze or a labyrinth. It's a story about love. Mr. Robot was a story about love too, and by its end, that's all I and a lot of people who watched it really cared about. The end of capitalism, the hacking, the multi-dimensional time travel, these are all important details in a mysterious and richly drawn world, but ultimately, what I ended up caring about in the end was the love between a brother and a sister, the love between a father and his son, the love between star-crossed lovers. And the same goes for Severance. I think, truly, the decision to make this a story on a smaller scale in Season 2 shows us that the sophomore season syndrome that affected Westworld and Lost is very unlikely to take root in the writer's room of Severance. I have the utmost confidence that by its conclusion, it will probably be hailed as one of the most influential television programs of this era, and it may even go on to be as genre-defining as Groundhog Day was, because at its heart, it's a story about grief, it's a story about love, and it's a story about trauma.